Today, I want to look at the painter of Lilliput. Lilliput, of course, meaning minutiae. He was called that by Émile Zola, who, of course, had the utmost scorn for Meissonier. Now, at the 1867 exhibition, Jean-Louis Ernst Meissonier had reached the height of his fame. Critics burbled excitedly, "Let us prostrate ourselves with Europe at the feet of one of the most glorious members of French art of all time." And Eugène Delacroix, who was to become basically the most revered painter of the Romantic era, and of course is so well known today, says just before his death of Meissonier, "He is the incontestable master of our epoch. Amongst all of us, surely it is he who will survive." Right? Now, this is the man who, by this time, was bristling with ribbons and medals and honours. He is the first painter ever to achieve the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honour, which had really been reserved for great victorious generals. So in the cultural field, he was more or less the equivalent of a Bonaparte. His campaign of France brought a fortune, and in fact this painting here, Friedland, the Battle of Friedland, which was measured about 2 feet by 2 feet and which took him literally 12 years to execute, was bought by an American, Stewart actually, who founded the great sort of Macy's, was it not Macy's, one of the great sort of department store links in America, paid 850,000 francs for it. Now, to put this in perspective, the Opera of Paris, with an entire orchestra, 70 dancers, and a year-long program, ran on a budget of 800,000. So this is to put it in perspective. He was the most expensive painter in Europe. His paintings brought the equivalent of a Raphael. Now, what is interesting here is that he dies, of course, in 1891. And within about 10 years, he's begun to sort of slip both in the prices that he'll bring, but also begin to slip off critical approval lists. And 20 years later, Ventini's third 2-volume of French history doesn't mention him at all. So in other words, by sort of 40 years, he has totally disappeared out of the canon of French art. And Meissonier has disappeared basically like a disgraced spy of the Stalinist era. What is even more interesting, in 1993, the French critic Jacques Tredier wrote about Meissonier, "Rare is the artist on whom more prejudice, even hatred, has accumulated than Meissonier. Not long ago, the mere act of looking at one of his works was considered worthy of excommunication." So this then is the most expensive painting of the 19th century, which we'll talk about in many ways today. At the same time as you have the most expensive painting, you also have the most notorious painting, Edouard Manet's Olympia, exhibited at the Salon of 1863. Now, this painting was so ignominious that even though it was accepted by the Salon, it took until 1907 before the Louvre would even consent to hang it on its walls. And of course, it now graces the walls of the Musée d'Orsay. So what I want to do with this lecture is to really look at the parallel, not so much parallel careers, but the intersecting careers of Meissonier and Manet, whose works were exhibited in the 1865 exhibition in the room marked M, side by side, and also to look at the way in which art tastes change, aesthetic tastes change. No one's heard of Meissonier. Who's ever seen the Battle of Friedland? However, the Déjeuner sur l'Herbe and Olympia, as I said last week, are now so ubiquitous that they are identified with being the essence of 19th century art. So these two men had a career which intersects not just in art, but also on not the battlefields, but on the barricades of Paris in 1870. So their careers intersect in many ways. Now, I want to look a little bit at who Meissonier was. As you know, I'm not always very interested in people's biography, with a date-by-date construction. Suffice it to say, he was born in Lyon and of a family of chemists. His mother died, and his father, of course, did what everyone did in those days, married the local laundress. And poor Meissonier was sort of sent off more or less on his own. His father decided that he needed toughening up, and so he wasn't given any warm clothes. He used to have to walk to school, miles to school, freezing cold. He used to buy chestnuts to put in his pocket to keep himself warm. And it wasn't until he was 19 and he earned enough money to buy himself a coat. Now, why am I telling you this? Is because he is one of these extremely stoical, workaholic people who was obviously formed very early by this sort of difficult upbringing. So what you have then is someone who is going to lead an incredibly full life from the sporting sphere onwards. Now, the other thing that really marks Meissonier is his dislike of the modern. He felt he was born out of his time. He disliked the railroads, he disliked modern life, he felt it was distracting, it was fleeting, and you will see this very much in the way in which he attempts to paint scenes that hark back to another era. His house itself gives you this idea. Now, I know I can't talk about neo-Gothic houses, but I didn't build this one. Now, what Meissonier did was to, when he actually had the second floor built in a kind of, revival style, some of the bricks weren't quite the right pink, so down came the second story, and it was reconstructed, and they weren't quite in parallel. Down it came again. He was a tooth-grinding, perfectionist. The same thing happens for the roof. Out of this building here, he managed to live an extraordinarily vigorous life. He'd get up at 5:30, read by himself, not just any stuff. It had to be Shakespeare or Dostoevsky. Then he'd wake his poor son, get him out of bed, go for a 2-hour gallop, come back, immediately race into his studio and paint for about 10 hours in a row. When he wasn't doing that, he was having a few breaks fencing in the fencing thing that he had downstairs. I mean, there was never a moment when he wasn't either thinking, painting, or running around in a frenzy. And this really feeds very much into his painting style, particularly when we see his painting of horses and his interest in equine locomotion that appears in the second phase of his art. Now, this is Meissonier painting here. This is actually a very large canvas for him, but you'll see there's interest in horses in the background. And as we were mentioning before, these artists of this time weren't the outsiders that we associate 19th century art with being, the bohemian fringe. These were people who were the mainstream, had immense prestige, were immensely wealthy. Now, getting back to his life, he was apprenticed to a pharmacist and spent most of his time doodling. And in fact, he will doodle all the time right through to the end of his life. He doodles on walls. In fact, he's actually a graffitist, a serial graffitist. These doodles actually earn him the attention of an artist who's a friend of the family, who actually managed to get him into the studio of Léon Cogniet. Now, who has heard of Léon Cogniet? He was one of he had a second prize at the Academy. He was one of these great Academy painters, paints these massive history frescoes, looking at the great moments of French history here, the exposition of Napoleon Bonaparte I to Egypt. So, of course, what you combine here is history painting with Orientalism or exoticism, which we'll look at next week. Now, he's not very good at history paintings, very large paintings. This is something that he finds difficult to execute and will concentrate on very, very small canvases, as we'll see in a moment. So he's advised by his mentors to leave history painting aside after this rather unconvincing Isaiah, and turns his attention to lithographs. But because by this time he's actually married, quite young, he's about in his early 20s, a Protestant girl, and his father gives him a nice set of cutlery and says, well, that's it, people who marry have to support themselves. So Meissonier is obliged to leave the great frescoes of history painting to concentrate on actually earning some money. And he does this by producing these little vignettes or little illustrations in books. And he finds that they sell very well. and begins to paint very small genre paintings. So this is going to be the first style, in fact one of the styles for which he is the best known. Now, do people actually, are anyone here familiar with his work? No, in the other group no one was. My only connection with Meissonier had been in my grandfather's garage. There was a lithograph of one of his paintings. So it was in that sort of generation where he was still considered the lion of French art. So he produces then in this first half these little genre very much in the Dutch style. Now, this was a quite successful painting in 1833, and it is at the time when we have the two great painters of the 19th century at the peak of their power. This, I mean, Delacroix, who symbolises or who stands for the idea of colour. Remember that at the Academy there was always this debate between the importance of drawing or disegno and colour. So Delacroix, the great romantic artist, will be the person who is considered the great colourist, and the person who is the great other painter at the time, Ingres, is the person who relies very much on line. And remember, they really found it very difficult to get on. They had different views of art. Now, these views of art, you have to remember also that there's the third thing that I wanted to mention about the biography of Meissonier, is that, of course, by having gone through lithographs and then starting out in the genre school, he actually didn't go to the École des Beaux-Arts, and he didn't compete for the Prix de Rome. So this means that he was not self-taught, but he actually was outside the system, and so it's going to be even more extraordinary that he was going to reach such great heights of prestige. Now, because he was sort of outside of the mainstream genre, he developed ideas very early about what art should be. And he thought that art was basically a struggle to depict nature. And by nature he didn't mean landscapes, he meant realism. Now, realism we usually associate with Courbet. This was a very different realism. It was the ability to depict something as though it looks as though it is real, which is different from depicting a scene of modern life. Do you understand what I mean? It's a depiction of this idea of always painting from an object and never from memory or from inspiration. So he had the idea that much too much fuss was made about the Italian canon of art. The great masters of the Italian school weren't to be emulated the way they should be, and that art in the 19th century should be a realist art, which is interesting, right, in comparison to what's going to happen with his rivals, the Impressionists. And so he turns his attention to a group who were realists, and these were, of course, the Dutch and Flemish school of the 17th century, of the golden age of Dutch painting. Now, this wasn't entirely novel. There already was in France a third stream, all right? You had the people with line who were interested in line, those who were interested in colour, academics, but also another academic stream of painting was that by Isabey. This, unfortunately, isn't a very good example, but which were small genre paintings. And Meissonier aligns himself with this group. Now, this is the sort of painting that he is going to emulate, because emulation was what was very important at the time. But Meissonier says very clearly that art doesn't develop if one is confined to painting or emulating a school of art. In other words, I'm going to be inspired by it but not copy it slavishly. And also, I'm not going to be confined to the work of one master, because he says a master is an artist whose works never make one think of those of some other artist, which is going to be interesting because, of course, Manet always refers to the great artists who went before him. So what he's going to do is use Dutch art as a kind of mediator. He's going to attach himself to a school of realism, a school which has an established canon, but he's going to change it to make it a kind of new universal school of French art. Now, what he's going to do then is take the very small format of the genre paintings of the Dutch school, but he's going to manipulate them in many ways. He's going to make them devoid of this theatrical nature of action or narration which is going on, and he's going to empty them also of sort of allegory, because as we'll see, most of Dutch art is taken from a proverb or something he's trying to teach. It's didactic. And he's also going to get rid of all of these objects as well, because he sees them as sort of taking away from the main focus of the figures. So he was known more or less as the French Metsu, or the French Jan Steen, and he is actually instrumental in a revival of interest in the Flemish and Dutch school. Vermeer becomes very much of interest towards the end of the 19th century via the interest of Meissonier. Now, this is the sort of thing that he will do with his paintings that he calls his painting of bonhomme, or little people. All right, now as you can see, he has a group, they're always men, a group who are focused. There is not very much in the way of action, there's no real allegory, and there's very little in the way of bits and pieces. However, if you look at this jug, it's not in that one, it's in another one, he actually reproduces this jug from another Dutch painting. Now, he says that what he is trying to do then is reach out to another school of realists across the time, and that all realists should join hands across the centuries. In other words, Giotto should join hands with Rembrandt, who should join hands with the Dutch school, now with the 19th century. And this is going to be the new style of painting. Now, this is the sort of thing that he wasn't going to paint. He's going to paint the format, he's going to paint the genre, he's going to paint sort of people inside, but he's not going to have any kind of narrative. See, here we have In Luxury Lookout, here we have a Dutch interior where all sorts of naughty things are going on. You have the main central figure here has got a glass of wine on the crotch of this fellow here, which obviously abides for no good. You have a man up here with a duck looking over here. You have the child stealing from the pantry. The dog representing gluttony is eating the food. This is neglect. All the wine's pouring out here. Even the child's looking a bit horrified. Everything is on the floor. There's a pig eating the roses. And all of this represents the fact that these people are having such a good time. They haven't noticed what is hanging over their heads, which is the sticks with which they will be beaten when they're going to the beggar's prison, crutches when they're going to be old and decrepit, and so on. All of this is going to actually fall on them. So this is the kind of thing that happened in Dutch art, but he is not going to use that at all. He wants it to depict reality, but small genre scenes. Now, these were very popular with the bourgeoisie. Remember, it's for exactly the same reason as Dutch art takes off in the 17th century, is that you get this rise of a merchant class who has a lot of money, who now have homes which they want to decorate, and so they want small paintings. These people don't want massive history paintings. They don't own mansions where you can actually have one entire wall taken over by truth jumping out of a well. So here you have these cavaliers which you will see constantly. Now, I just want to give you another example. He was prolific in his paintings. As you can see, we're going up now to the 1848 revolution. Now, his son, Charles Meissonier, continues sort of anachronistically with exactly the same sorts of scenes that you can see. Now, here is another example of Metsu, Gabriel Metsu, a man writing a letter. So you get this very studied Dutch interior with the open window, with reference to the Dutch countryside, and someone absorbed totally in their occupation. Now, why would someone, first of all, who believes in realism, why would he decide he had to paint historical subjects? And the reason for this was that he thought that, I'll just go on a little bit further, people in the 19th century were incapable of absorption. So anyhow, they're very much this idea of being able to be absorbed in a task, firstly, and secondly, the elegance of gesture. he felt that people no longer in the 19th century could do this because life was so rapid, people were distracted, their movements had become ungainly, clothes, 19th century clothes were difficult to represent. One didn't have any sort of elegance in these poses, and so he insists in going back and replicating these costumes and behaviour of the 18th century. Now, he's fascinated also by the idea of absorption in a task. He was sometimes accused of theatricality because this idea of having these people set in anachronistic scenes meant that there was too much happening in the picture plane, and so he gets away from this by placing just one figure in the picture plane who is concentrating incredibly on what he's doing. So there's this idea of total absorption in his task, and so the viewer, rather than being told a story or a high moral idea, is invited also to be absorbed completely in this act of creation. And the act of creation is not one which is an act of inspiration. We don't have Bouguereau's Cupids fluttering round. We don't have, the genius, remember, that we saw inspiring Greece and Egypt. Here we have simply a man with his brush who is a realist. I mean, painting really is painting what you see in minute detail. So we sort of watch him, and he is looking very clearly at just the right brush stroke. And so there are numerous canvases where he actually puts forward this idea of the importance of the studio. Now, what is important also with Meissonier is that he refused to paint from memory. Right? He had this idea that he always used models throughout the time that he was painting, which was years. You know what I mean? People aged incredibly while he was painting, but he has to actually have someone in front of him so that he can exactly reproduce what he sees. Now, he couldn't finish a canvas unless he actually had the right hat, right? So, and the right kind of coat. So if he wanted to produce a model who was someone who was a painter in the 18th century, he would scour the markets for the correct kind of 18th century coat, or he would borrow one from someone's ancestors and have it reproduced. If he didn't actually have the right ribbon for the person's hair, he couldn't complete the painting, right? And this was because you had to have absolute veracity, even though it is a veracity of another century. And it's really quite interesting because, of course, at this time you're getting the development of photography, which gives you the idea that there is such a thing as a very true image of something of the time. Now, he didn't like 19th century painting because in many ways it refers too much to the present, which he didn't like, and also it locates people too much geographically as well. We'll talk about that later. So he has a series then of people absorbed in tasks, in creative tasks, lonely creative tasks. Here we have the flute player. This would have been a costume for which this man probably would have posed for over a year in exactly the same position with the right type of shoes and exactly the right type of stockings. And this, of course, becomes extraordinarily obsessive. It's okay when you're actually painting one person in a studio, but when you're painting the charge of Napoleon's entire cavalry, you can imagine how difficult this becomes. Here we have this man who's absorbed in reading, and it's right down to the fact of what he's reading. He's not reading anything 19th century. What do you have in the 19th century? You have a newspaper. Now, imagine folding the Age, be standing like this in an ungainly, what Meissonier considers an ungainly sort of posture. It doesn't give this idea of focus of attention. People had beautifully bound books. People opened them with loving care, not like that in the 19th century. So you must go back to a time of elegance and a time of realism. Even all of his subjects, all of these are tiny paintings. There's actually one of them in the NGV, which is some of them are 50 centimetres by 70 centimetres. And this was quite important because it meant that the viewer has to concentrate on the person in the picture plane who is concentrating. So you get this ricochet in many ways of concentration. You had to concentrate so hard that John Ruskin, the great art critic who was a great fan of Meissonier, had to buy a magnifying glass to actually look at them through it. And so once you actually have to do that, you have the attention of the viewer is focused minutely. You know, you can't actually stand in front of one of these canvases and just spray your eyes over it. You have to be focused. So this was, in many ways, not a measure of economy. It was a way in which he was manipulating the spectator to enter into his universe. Now, Gabriel Metzu, to whom he was compared, was a specialist in these sort of Dutch interiors where you often have women, and you'll notice that women are virtually totally absent from Meissonier's paintings. He was a man who was a man of great sportsman, didn't really have terribly much time for the female sphere. So here you have in Dutch painting a narration, the well-run household, everything is correctly done. The lady is reading a letter. She's obviously had it brought in by the maid. The maid is pulling aside a curtain showing a ship, which probably means that the letter is from either a lover or a husband who is away, also bearing reference to the importance of the Dutch in shipping and in their colonial enterprises. Well, all of that goes. So all of that sort of narration, all of that placing it in a historical concept goes. With the art of Meissonier, it is simply something which pleases the eye and which is quite static. What he's trying to do is really grab one moment in time. And I think this time dimension is very important in the 19th century because this is at a time when modernity is based on the idea of the fleetingness of time, and this is what the Impressionists, of course, will attempt to reproduce in their paintings. Whereas Meissonier is aware that time has altered, the perception of time has altered, and he is trying to actually locate and grab one moment and eternalize it, stop it. All right, and this is going to be very, very obvious in his works where you have horses running and so on. But here for the moment we now have people again in a studio, not just one person concentrating, but another person looking at another person concentrating. So we are looking at the other person, looking at the person. So do you see in this tiny framework in, again, reference to the importance of the artist's studio. The same thing here. This makes it very obvious what the art of painting is. It's this idea of connoisseurship. Here you have, this would quite possibly have all been the same model, as we'll see in a moment. But again, what is painting? It is putting pigment on a canvas, right? It's not thinking and being inspired. It's very much, and it's this minute sort of labour, this extraordinary work that an artist has to go through to actually produce a masterpiece. And everyone is focusing their attention on this moment when the pigment is going to be placed on the canvas. And this would have been a great moment. Now, Meissonier was famous for being, it was often called the Penelope of painting, the idea of Penelope, who was the wife of Ulysses. She used to weave all day and then she used to unpull it at night because she had said that she would marry one of her suitors when she'd finally finished weaving what she was making. So he used to do the same thing. He'd spend all day painting and then he'd scrape it off at night and start again, which was one of the reasons why these things took years and years to produce. Again, just simply to give you an idea of how prolific he was, but again, it's people concentrating on a game or something in front of them. Now, I just wanted to show you this one, the Sergeant's Portrait of 1874, where again we have a group of men, no women at all. But what is interesting here is that each of these men is exactly the same model. Right? He has actually placed the same person, just simply in different positions. And he did this deliberately because he was trying to make the point, again, that an artist must be able to paint what he sees and he knows. He must not paint from memory. That is the worst thing you can do. He's considered Ingres' work as sterile, Vernet's work as sterile, because they were using memory. One had to reproduce reality. Better to reproduce the same face 6 times, because you can do it well, than have a whole series of faces that aren't exactly reproduced in exact detail. The stubble, you know, the hair and the ears. I mean, this is amazing. If you get out a magnifying glass, you can spend hours marvelling over the details. It's not for the short-sighted, this sort of, right. Now, when he wasn't actually painting, he was a compulsive doodler, as I said, and one person wrote in his diary how he was walking along near the Grande Maison outside Poissy, and he sort of saw a great sort of figure, a Napoleonic figure, which had been sketched in chalk on someone's barn. In other words, this man would, you know, whenever the sort of the feeling took over, he would actually do quite large sketches anywhere. So all up people's staircases, on people's doors, you'd find sketches. And in fact, this Polichinelle, the original sketch for it, was on the door of a well-known courtesan who had the foresight, as courtesans did, they were wily business ladies, of cutting this out and actually selling it. So much for the door. So this is one of his Polichinelle. I'm sure you must have seen reproductions of this. Now, his sort of favourite group by now would be these cavaliers, these sort of rather sort of arrogant sort of men who are, and he was accused really of dressing up actors, but he didn't see it like that. He saw this as a return to realism, to a time when you weren't distracted by other ideals, that he was linking as French art now with the Dutch concept, and also with a time when elegance was important. Now, it wasn't just Meissonier who was interested in this historical time phrase. It had become very important in Romantic literature. I mean, if you think of Sir Walter Scott, you know, Ivanhoe, as the French would call him, Ivanhoe, he was immensely popular at the time, and he begins the development of the romantic novel, starts with these outlandish, you know, cavalier figures. And of course, no one else but Alexandre Dumas. This is actually his son, but Alexandre Dumas was a great friend of Meissonier. Of course, the Mount of Monte Cristo, and so on. So these swashbuckling heroes were sort of a stock in trade, and of course we have many of them, all of them quite self-consciously looking. Now, we'd actually talked about this particular painting last week, saying that it actually fed into a polemic or a propaganda regime of Napoleon III. Now remember, we're actually looking now at 1848, which was that revolution which brought Napoleon III into power as the Prince President. And he will then, a couple of years later, stage a coup d'etat and crown himself as emperor, as his uncle had. But what is interesting is that briefly in 1848, Meissonier was actually on the barricades in the centre, and he did a very uncharacteristic painting for Meissonier. It was actually slightly larger than the sort of requisite 70 by 50 centimetres, and it depicted very inelegant people in inelegant poses, and particularly dead bodies, with rubble piled up in the foreground and really a desolate-looking Paris in the background. Now, it was almost looking as though Meissonier was going to leave his beloved bonhomme that we will see here for maybe making some sort of political statement. You know, remember last week we were talking about the importance of realism and the way in which the Napoleonic regime worked to subvert the realists who were critical of their regime in their art, to get them to move more towards the centre, to still paint realistically, but for it to be a realism which enhanced the regime of Napoleon III rather than criticised it. And remember, I said that it was Meissonier who would be befriended and basically persuaded by the Duc de Morny, flattered, if you wanted to put it that way. He was a very vain little pompous man. He was flattered to becoming, you know, the painter, not one of the regime propaganda painters, but to abandon this somewhat unruly, rather undignified sort of painting, and to go back to what he did best, which was this decorative genre painting. And so it's no chance that in 1855 we now get a return to these little paintings of you know, genre scenes very much in the Dutch way. However, he's left the painter absorbed in his studio, the flute player, the violin player, the reflective smoker, and we now have more violent scenes. So in other words, he's translated that sort of violence that is imminent in society back into the 17th century, back into costume, and anaesthetised it. So this is now a kind of middle-of-the-road realism, which is absolutely acceptable to the regime. And indeed, this painting will be bought by Napoleon III himself when he wants to make a gift to Prince Albert. He wants to make a link between Britain and France, and so who does he choose? It's Meissonier, of course, and it's this particular fight that Prince Albert valued very much. Now, other paintings, such as the Bravi or the Hired Assassins, you know, you still have this idea, all right, of the Dutch painting, but there's an edge to it now. There's this sense that you need guards to actually guard against something, right? You know, they're at the door, maybe there's a disturbance going on. There's a kind of air of menace in this kind of absorption that you actually have now. Now, another person who becomes obsessed with Meissonier is the Duke of Hertford, is that right? Hertford, who will be instrumental in setting up the Wallace collection. And there are 16 Meissoniers in the Wallace collection. He actually wanted to buy the most expensive of all of the paintings, but Meissonier took so long to produce it that he died, basically waiting, and that is why Friedland is now in the collection in America. Now, we now get to the Salon des Refusés, which I suppose is sort of the watershed in the developments of art in the middle of the 19th century. Remember, we were talking last week of the Comte de Nieuwerkerque, who was the, you know, inside that sort of cabinet of Napoleon III, his half-brother Duc de Morny. Nieuwerkerque was in charge of fine arts. He reformed the academy, he reformed fine arts teaching. And it was he who, in 1863, had made it clear, or in fact in 1862, that for the next year, paintings would only be exhibited every 2 years, and that each artist could only exhibit 3. Now, this of course meant that since this was the only forum, or practically the only forum for putting your art out into the public, it meant that artists who didn't make the cut would have to wait another 2 years to be seen. Now, it seems strange that someone like Meissonier, who had been given prizes all along and whose little bonhomme were, the most expensive paintings in Europe, who was always accepted, who was a member of the jury himself, who had won prizes, should object to Nieuwerkerque's decision. And in fact, we get the first conjunction of another person who was painting at the time, Edouard Manet, and Ernst Meissonier. They both sign a document objecting to Nieuwerkerque's decisions, and it will be Manet who will take it to him. And the biggest signature on the top of this long list of people will be that of Ernest Meissonier, member of the Academy. Now that's about as high as you can get. Why did he actually object to this? It's because he felt that an artist should be allowed to exhibit as many paintings as possible, particularly himself, and he wanted, it was also because his works took so long to be produced. he really needed to have them shown when they finally came out, or else it would be another 10 years before people saw them. So he says to Nieuwerkerk, you know, if you don't come up with what I want, I will not exhibit. And Nieuwerkerk says, fine, that's all right. Don't exhibit. So, for the first year, since about 1833, there is no Meissonier at the Salon of 1863. Now, this, of course, is one of these that I thought was quite amusing. This is this idea of Nieuwerkerk being the poodle of the regime. There he is, the caniche, with an April Fool fish on his tail. Here is the Journal Amusant, shows that sort of this was a salon when the ancient world, or the antiquity, had to court modern art. Right, so I think that's quite a sweet way of putting it. Here we have, of course, the jury. Now, of course, in 1863, Meissonier might not be exhibiting, but he was a member of the jury. Now, this is the jury who, you know, will make the decision that of the 5,000 paintings submitted, only 2,000 would be accepted. And there is a general sort of hubbub about this. Now, we have to remember that the Salon wasn't just, you know, an opening of a few paintings being stuck on walls. It was the social event of the year. Remember, we were saying that there was something like 250,000 people went through it per day. The press talked about it on the front page every week. And the vernissage, this moment when people put the last touches of varnish, literally, on their paintings. Here they are on their ladders. These people have already got their position. They've been skied. So look at the ladders you had to get onto. You had to be pretty, you know, intrepid to actually paint in those days. Not for people with fear of heights. These people, the massive size of paintings too. I mean, in comparison to these tiny little masterpieces that you're going to get. So this then is the social event of the year. So it's very, very important, and it's an event which Napoleon III cannot just afford to have turn into a scandal. He's at a moment when he has already called elections, and he is, even though he runs a police state and he has some control of the press and he has a secret police, he's not sure of re-election, and there's already the problem with the politics of Mexico. The Emperor Maximilian has been gunned down, and he just does not want another controversy which could feed and bleed out into a general controversy in Paris. So he hot-foots it down to the Louvre, wants to have a look at the paintings that have been rejected, immediately says that there should be a salon of those that have been refused, and buys one of them himself, which is a clever move, probably prompted by the Duc de Morny, a very sophisticated mover indeed. This meant that not all the paintings, however, that were rejected would go on show. A number of painters, including, for example, Fontaine-Latour, decided that they wouldn't exhibit because they were afraid of exhibiting next to people who were absolutely hopeless daubers. And it's only when Whistler, who actually writes to Fontaine-Latour saying, for Christ's sake, you know, let's be of our time, that he will decide to exhibit. Now, nothing's changed in 1863. Who wins the prize of the medal of it will be Jérôme, who we'll look at next week. The great history painter, of course, with the tinging this idea of the fantasy of cruelty of the Orient. You know, these are great themes which we'll look at: sensuality, savagery, need to be civilized, and so on. The mists of the utter fantasy of exoticism, which was prized. The other painting, however, which drew quite a lot of controversy, but which was accepted and hung, was this Birth of Venus. Now, I'm talking about this because Cabanel, of course, was one of these pompier artists that we spoke about last week, but also because of the importance of the nude, and I'm going to compare this with Olympia when Manet actually produces it a couple of years later. Now, this was the conceit, was that, you know, that basically the naked body was it proved the painter's ability to paint. And remember, we spoke of the idea that through the naked body, one went to the ideas behind it, to the Platonic ideals of beauty, the timeless morality that could be extracted from looking at, you know, the naked body. And someone actually made the statement that, you know, when you look at a nude woman in a painting, you should be thinking of geometry and the higher ideals of life, and certainly not being, you know, sucked into sort of looking at her as anything except an ideal. Now, of course, critics positively drooled when they were sort of talking about this painting here. But some of them actually were really rather offended. They were saying that she isn't really one of these ideal nudes. She looks like one of the prostitutes from up on the street of Breda. She's got the bedroom eyes, you know, the airbrushed armpits and all the rest, with her sort of rear quarters presented very much to the front of the painting. So there was a kind of already a controversy about the role of the female nude, which of course is going to come to a head when Manet produces his Olympia. However, Napoleon III won't have a bit of it. He loves it, and he immediately buys it for his own private collection. Now, what is important about here is that, however, despite the fact that people thought they could recognise the local prostitute, the painting was obeying the canons of the representation of the female nude. You could look at this without sort of, you know, lascivious feelings, because she represented something else. She is part of a narration, all right? She represents Venus, or she could have been truth emerging from the waves, or France floating on idealism, or you could put anything that you wanted, but she's not, you know, Marianne from Breda Street. You know, the idea was that she represented something beyond, and this, of course, is what Olympia will not do. Now, in the exhibition of 1863, you're going to get the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which is put forward by Edouard Manet. And it's hard to believe the furor that this and Olympia would produce. Now, firstly, it produced a furor because people couldn't read it. They didn't actually understand what it was about. Well, we still don't, really. I mean, is there anything to understand? No, it's basically paint on canvas. But people were used to thinking in allegorical terms, or looking at elevated allegories or history, or looking at great events of one's past, but simply the idea of art as narration, didactic, and morality. Whereas here you have no narration at all. You've got a couple of people sitting in the park with a naked woman, and it looks like a nymph in the background. Well, you can't imagine a story, a narration that goes around that. Well, maybe you could think of them as being dwellers on Mount Olympus, but no, that doesn't work either, because you've got this discarded 19th century dress here, so you're brought completely back to the modern day. And the conjunction here of people here who are dressed in modern 19th century clothes. In fact, they look very much like students from the Latin Quarter who've actually gate crashed a party with the nymphs. So it was very, very difficult to read it all. And not only, I mean, people didn't object quite so much to the fact that she was naked. After all, they were used to sort of having Venus rising from the sea in all different ways. She wasn't idealised. She's got these little love handles here, and she looks as though she could do with a bit of toning up. You know, she actually really is, she's painted as she is, not idealised, not airbrushed. They really had more of a problem with this painting of people in modern costume. Now, this is what Meissonier had avoided, you know, this idea of modernity. Now, this was the big problem, the big controversy. Baudelaire, the art critic, had said, you know, we have to paint modern life. We have to show that we can be heroic in our top hats and in our breeches. Il faut être de notre temps. We must be of our time. But people found it difficult to actually, people who were located very much in society of the time couldn't really represent ideals at all. So this is why, actually, when you get a lot of paintings in the 19th century, they often try and neutralise the dress that people are in. So they often paint people in mourning, because mourning clothes didn't really change across the centuries very much. That was always sort of black. Okay, the style might be slightly different, but the colours and all were the same. Or they painted people who were in sort of nondescript uniforms. The attempt was to neutralise the present day. So what kind of painting was this if there's no narration? Is it a still life? Well, yes, you've got a still life here, but is it a figure painting? Is it a genre painting? Well, might be. You've actually got a group of figures here, and so on. absolutely impossible to understand. The other thing that was, of course, scandalous was that there was no chiaroscuro. Right, chiaroscuro, this putting of layer upon layer, build-up of layers which showed that one understood contour, that one understood anatomy, that one understood the old masters, and so on. None of this was there. This really was an amoral painting, simply not because of its subject matter, but because of its technique. However, Manet had done really what Meissonier didn't want to do, which was refer to a painting from the past. Now, Manet is very much saying, I understand art history, I understand that emulation of the great masters is extremely important, and I can do it. However, I'm going to do something different with it. Now, this is many ways what Meissonier had done with his little Dutch interiors. He'd also taken a style, but he'd emptied it in many ways of its significance and taken away the reference to a master, right? Whereas you can really very clearly locate the great master that Manet is referencing. This is Marcantonio Raimondo, who actually has done a lithograph of a painting after Raphael. The Raphael has been lost, but this is the lithograph which remains, with the river god there, as you can see, very much in the position of this boy there. This nude here, very much in the position of Victorien Meurent. And the other character who is in a slightly different position. And down here, actually, if you see the entire painting, you will see that there's actually a still life right down in the corner as well, which Manet has replicated with modern objects. Also, he makes reference to Giorgioni's pastoral concert, which, of course, has never been explained, but you get already this idea of the great masters painting figures, naked figures in a landscape with men in the costume of the time. The other painter who had his work rejected was none other than Jemmy Whistler, who was also attempting to do the same sort of thing. Here, people sort of thought this girl looked ridiculous. In fact, what Whistler is attempting to do is to look at the tones of white on white. As you know, Whistler, that was the main idea behind Whistler's compositions. Now we now get to the Salon of 1865, and this is the time when you're now going to get the cross between Manet and Meissonier. Meissonier, who was already on the jury which rejected Manet's painting, will now in 1865 be on the 1865 jury, but also be exhibiting. And so in room M, you will now get Manet next to Meissonier, right? So you're going to have these tiny little painting which is going to attract the public. I mean, they had to put barricades up. People wanted to see Meissonier so much that they had to have turnstiles, you know, and people around guarding this tiny little masterpiece. Now, when Meissonier was elected to the Academy, he, unusually, as I said, because he hadn't gone through his paces, he hadn't gone through the Beaux-Arts, he hadn't been through the Prix de Rome, he hadn't spent that time absorbing the old masters, which is one of the reasons he rejects the Italian canon. He does say, you know, the history painting is the greatest of all painting. It's a pity that the Dutch didn't paint history paintings. However, from now on, I will pursue history painting. And he does this with a series which is going to look at the great victories of the Napoleons. And this is the one of Napoleon III, the victory at Solferino, which I think I mentioned before, shows these tiny little figures of Napoleon III out in front, not as engaged in battle, but as the mastermind, looking over the new style of battle with the new weapons of long-range warfare, showing that he can actually oversee it from a distance. Now, Meissonier would not paint anything from memory. We've established that. So this meant that when he wanted to do the French campaign, which really, if you've got good eyesight, is quite a compelling painting. It's this moment when Napoleon has come back from the great defeat. He has rallied the remnants of his army ready for the great battle of Waterloo. And you have Maréchal Ney behind, these rather desolate sort of soldiers who sort of fear that the worst is about to happen, but the sort of the grimness and determination of Napoleon, even went down to the stubble on his chin, is actually very well depicted. Now, Meissonier wanted to make sure that this was realistic. So, he decided who was going to paint as Napoleon? Well, who better than himself? And so he's the same stature. He actually then went to Prince Jérôme, who is Napoleon's brother, and managed to find the great coat that Napoleon Bonaparte had worn in this particular campaign, because you couldn't paint it unless you actually had the correct coat, right? So he managed to have the coat. He actually went to someone who was a survivor, who could remember what Napoleon's saddle looked like, and he had this recreated in detail. He had to have the right craftsman who produced the right thing. He actually had to have the right kind of felt hat produced with, I think it was Tony was telling me it was beaver skin that was used, so you had to get the right beavers for the right hat, you can see why his paintings took so long and were so expensive. So he then manages to hoist himself up in the saddle, and it has to be in a snowy, wintry background. So there we have Meissonier sitting out in the snow on a wooden horse in the costume, looking at himself in a mirror, trying to paint exactly what he sees. Now, this is very handy, that the fact that he had spent all that time freezing to death when he was a young man. I mean, he really was extremely hardy. He really had this work ethic that was extraordinary. But he actually took things really to an extreme. And one day someone found him painting excitedly this particular painting in the nude, just with a kind of a truss on. And the painter said, the friend said, have you got some kind of, problem? And he said, no, the emperor always wore this suspensoir, this kind of underwear. So in other words, right down to Napoleon's underwear, you had to have everything exactly right, because it might affect the way he sat on the horse. Do you see what I mean? He by chance met in a train one day someone who had actually fought with Maréchal Ney, and he found the way in which Maréchal Ney used to put his cloak, all right? And so he would then get someone else to sit with the cloak, and he'd put, I think it was gelatin in it, so that the cloak would freeze in a position and would not move. Well, that's all right, we'll get to the horses later, but what about the landscape? How do you actually get the right kind of furrows and so on? So what he does is he manages to hire a battalion of retired soldiers from the Napoleonic army who gallop round and round and round and round his backyard until they've actually ploughed it up the way this would have looked. He actually has cannon dragged along, but of course it wasn't snowing, was it? So how do you get the snow? So he puts out salt. Well, that's no good, it dissolves. He then puts out sugar, then you get an invasion of mice, and so finally, to get the right white, he actually then has the whole thing covered in flour. So it's really quite an extraordinary way. Now, I will talk about horses in a moment, because he becomes the great painter of horses of the 19th century. Now, as you can see, this is people looking at Meissonier's works. This is the crowd that was in front of his work. You couldn't get in there, and of course people peering to see what was happening. Now, in the exhibition of 1863 then, in fact, no, it's 1865, Manet paints it in 1863, doesn't want to exhibit it because he thinks it's too controversial. We finally have, next to this great battle scene, which is, of course, the glory, Solferino and the campaign, which is the glory of the Salon, you have this nude who absolutely scandalises everyone. Now, why was she so scandalous? Well, basically because she, first of all, does not relate to the narrative of the nude of the time, all right? The idea of the nude being truth or beauty or allegorically, or a young woman who is with great sort of, pudeur, putting, clothing her eyes, and you can see the entire figure, but the eyes are covered over, she's so modest. This woman has no modesty at all. She's looking straight back at the viewer. All right? So in other words, the viewer is invited to actually enter via her gaze into this whatever is going on in this particular painting. There might be no narration, but it is quite clear, however, that these flowers have been offered by an admirer out in the behind the curtain, and that she is none other just simply than someone who is a prostitute. Now, what was really alarming was that Manet was clearly alluding to the great masters again. This is Titian's Venus of Urbino. This was the kind of painting which was probably put in a marriage chamber when young people were married, to sort of give them the idea of what's supposed to be going on. And here you have the servant in the background looking at the marriage chest. Now, you have virtually the same disposition of the body, with the same, with her hand over her groin, a flower which is represented here, which is probably the flower of purity or the rose of Venus, and the little dog representing fidelity here. Well, what's happened here is it's all changed. The dog's turned into a cat, and the cat, of course, represents, shut means sort of female genitalia, or also it could mean a prostitute. The servant has turned into a black maid, and the flower is now in the hair, and another word for a prostitute was a camellia, right? So there's no doubt that this is flesh which is being consumed in a commercial basis. There's no ideas of allegories of married love or truth or beauty or Mount Olympus. Now it was just considered scandalous, and mainly because, that's also referring to Goya as well. The press went to town on this. They sort of said that she was a coal monger. She's La Femme de l'Ébéniste. She's the wife of the ebonist by Manet. She looked like a cadaver. She was disintegrating on the block. She was blue. She was a gorilla. And in the end, Tepers was so afraid that the painting had to be skied. It was already not on the line because it hadn't been given a lot of votes. It was put right up high so that people couldn't actually start hitting it with their umbrellas. So it was a success in some senses. Now this again we saw last year. My goodness, these people worried about another Salon of Venuses. And this of course is interesting, the portrait of Émile Zola, who comes to the defence of Manet, writing in his critique of the Salon, talking actually in a derogatory way about Meissoniers, the Lilliputian people, and how they refer to the past, and how one should paint one's time. In reference to his defence, we have the Olympia here, but she's not looking over here as she should. She's looking at Zola. Well, now I want to actually talk very much about that other creature that we saw in the painting of the Campaign of France, which is the horse. Now, as I said, Meissonier was considered not just a painter of genre scenes or the greatest painter of history scenes, but also the greatest investigator of equine motion and the representation of horses who had ever lived. This is how it was considered. Now, the horse, of course, was extremely important in history painting. First of all, because in battle scenes it was the major means of locomotion. A battle was fought and won really on the strength of its cavalry. And, of course, the crack troops were cavaliers, simply because often they were people who owned horses, and often they were, came out of a higher class. The foot soldiers were often the poor peasants, where you get the foot slog literally coming from that idea. But the horse also, of course, represents all that is noble, the union between nature and man, the nobility of the beast which has been tamed for man's purposes, and all of that sort of thing. And you get this very much in this painting of David with Napoleon crossing the Alps. The majesty of the rearing horse enhances the majesty of Bonaparte, who is able to pull off his great victories, as did other great generals. They're written down here. In the rock, Charlemagne, Hannibal, and Bonaparte, even though Hannibal used elephants. Now, Meissonier had a little bit of a problem insofar as, he was considered as the greatest painter of the time, he was worried about how he was going to be perceived by posterity, because he actually didn't paint any nudes. Now, he deliberately didn't paint any. He wanted to be a realist, and there weren't a lot of nudes standing round, at the time. So he had decided that basically the nude had become a sterile form of art. Often people who were simply copying statues. And so all of his characters we saw with his bonhomme were clothed. Now, once you actually clothe your main characters, they are located in time and space. Remember, this was the polemic with the 19th century. How do you paint modern people and make them look great? So he locates his people very much in the 17th or 18th century, and he locates them very much in France as well. So to have the timelessness and the ideal that he needed, he turns to the depiction of horses. And he becomes an expert in this. As you can imagine, this is the man who ploughs up the fields and does this. He goes into it in great detail. He goes to the zoo, he studies horse anatomy, skeletons, musculature. He does the whole sort of Leonardo da Vinci thing. He doesn't actually dissect horses, but he has to look at them in great detail. So every one of his horses will be shown as an individual breed, with its own individual character, and also with its own individual locomotion. And he's actually going to be the first person who is going to do an extensive study of equine locomotion. And this is going to be, he sees it as his contribution to culture across the board. And he actually says the painter's art is to come to the aid of history. But he also thought he was coming to the aid of science. Now, what was amazing that when he actually dies, for these tiny little paintings that he produces, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sketches or oil sketches or small paintings representing the horses or the people in all forms. So here you have this example. You can see the sheen on the skin, you can see every sinew. The motion, as we'll see in a moment, was studied in extraordinary, excruciating detail. Now, he had 8 horses of him. He owned them himself. And he was so famous for his horse paintings that his fame had spread throughout Europe. And during the 1870 occupation of Paris, the outskirts of Paris, by the Prussians, they occupied his house. But his reputation was so wonderful that none of them looted his paintings, even these tiny little paintings like this, which would have been easy to put in a knapsack. Whereas, you get Pizarro, the Prussians also occupy his house. They use his paintings for firewood and so on. So this then are these paintings of horses that he gets in all different positions. When he wasn't actually, as we'll see, how he studies equine motion, he actually makes little figures, wax figures of the horse in a particular gait with the rider in a particular position. And when that isn't enough, he then actually gets the rider in a position and then puts bits of lead and so on in the cape to stiffen it so that he can then paint it exactly, because he couldn't always get someone in that position on a horse in a field. All right, so this idea of absolute freezing that instant, right? Which is going to be the exact opposite of what the Impressionists are going to do. But it is still this obsession with this idea of time. And how do you depict a moment? And what he becomes, the way in which he's going to depict it is by obsessing about the motion of horses' legs. Now, I just wanted to talk very, very briefly about the importance of horses at the time. We saw of horses in battles and what it represented, but in the mid-19th century, of course, you get this obsession of the upper classes with horse racing. The Duc de Morny comes back from England. He brings with him the Jockey Club, who, when they weren't basically setting fashions and creating new words for the French language, such as redingote, were creating the French bloodlines. And this is where you get the development of the Longchamp races. The people who raced were gentlemen jockeys. In, of course, the major Longchamp prizes, they perhaps would hire professionals, but basically one rode one's own horses. Longchamp here, the social event of the calendar outside the Salon. So these were the two big moments, the Salon vernissage and Longchamp. And here I want you to notice the way in which horses are depicted when they're galloping. Now, remember we talked last week also about the way in which the regime of Napoleon III harnesses realistic painting, tries to empty the criticism of Millet's paintings of the rural landscape, and so, or what's the word, sort of gives a lot of attention to Rosa Bonheur, who paints these rather anodyne paintings of livestock. She's the great animal painter, and she here also studies the motion of horses. Now, Degas also was very interested in the locomotion of horses. Here you have the false start. We have the jockey trying to pull back the horse. At the moment he has all four, or it looks as though all four legs are off the ground, but he does have the horse sort of splayed with the two at the front and the two at the back. And this is the way in which people painted horses who were galloping. Again, you can see the interest that Degas has of a horse which is actually about to bolt at the starting line. These people are lined up, and the motion of this horse is very much the centre of our view. Now, the way in which the locomotion of horses had been traditionally looked at was one painted a horse at a trot. Right? Now, Meissonier wasn't at all convinced that this was right, and of course, being the realist, you cannot do anything from memory, anything from assumptions, which again is basically what the Impressionists think. It's exactly the same thing. So, to make sure he actually gets it right, he has now a railway line, a round little railway line, installed in this long-suffering backyard. And on the railway line, he puts a rolling sofa. So he then gets some other long-suffering person who will, one of those things in the Buster Keating movies, pulls him along. He then hires a contingent of cavalry, again, who had to be people who had served under Napoleon. You couldn't have any local yokel. And they would gallop around at full speed while Meissonier, sitting on his sofa, would be pulled along the railroad, sketching wildly as he went. Now, the idea was that he had this idea that his eye was almost like a camera, that he could actually freeze these different moments, that speed could be broken down, I suppose, into moments which could be eternally captured, which is exactly the opposite from what the Impressionists want to do. So he then actually uses these sketches in all of his paintings so that you actually get horses using different forms of locomotion, and he has discovered from these experiments that in a gallop horses have a diagonal, the front leg and the back leg diagonally are moved, and in a trot it's the two front ones which go together. I think there's a difference in which kind of locomotion you have. So he was extremely proud of having done this, and in fact he worked with someone who was a taxidermist and someone from the zoo, and he was going to sort of contribute very much to his studies of equine locomotion. Now, this is the great Friedland that we have here. We have again this. This is the one that he spent 12 years on, right? As you can see, it's only very small. It's bigger than most of them, and it was basically trying to get this sketching of the exact motion of the horse, all the sinews, and so on, the flexion of the knees, the muscles, and the way in which they sort of are coming round. Now, in actual fact, this is sort of is going to be criticised for the way in which he has developed this. Now, Géricault in 1823 also was fanatically interested in horses, but he has this idea that horses do have all 4 feet off the ground, but they've got the 4 in front and the 4 at the back. Now, this is all very well. Even Manet actually has the same idea, and in fact it'll be proven true. So this is, you can see this fascination with movement. This is now Manet, as opposed to Meissonier, worlds apart, but converging in this same fascination of the passing moment. Well, we get Edouard Maybridge, who develops a whole series of instant clips in the 1860s. Would it be 1860s? 1870s, I think it is by now, where he is actually managed to photograph, I think it's 25 frames to a second, and he actually can see the motion of a horse. And I haven't got have I got the one of galloping here? I haven't, but he manages to show that in actual fact, at any given moment, the horse does have all four of his feet off the ground. Now, Meissonier hadn't thought that. He always said that they had to have one on the ground. Now, Meissonier is absolutely devastated. He says he will never take up, after having contested this for I don't know how long, he says, oh, but look, all of my sketches on the rolling sofa for years show that. And in the end, of course, he has to come to the conclusion that the eye does lie, but the camera doesn't. So he says he'll never pick up a brush again. Well, that was a sort of vain threat. But he says, I have been deceived all of these years. In other words, he was trying to paint. This is what he wanted to do, was to paint what the eye, or what we couldn't see. That was really what he was trying to do with all of these experiments. So by trying to paint what we didn't see, he actually painted something that doesn't exist. Now, this was horrible for someone who'd spent 40 years painting reality. Now, I wanted to actually contrast this with, of course, the Impressionists, who also are fascinated with what one sees, right? But there is this idea of capturing the moment, whereas Meissonier sees it as a static moment. What the Impressionists see is simply the impression on your retina at a time, which is not a frozen moment, but was something which is very fluid or in flux. So they came at this interest in speed, in this interest in the sort of transient nature of the transits of time, but arrived at it from completely different points of view. And the Impressionists, of course, with their art, develop a new vocabulary for dealing with the idea of transience, whereas Meissonier is literally stuck in the past. Now, at the 1867 exhibition, Napoleon III, of course, uses it as a great propaganda exercise and has a pavilion dedicated to the great art of the French. Well, of course, guess who's there? We have Friedland, which, of course, is incomplete. It's only been worked on for 10 years. We have Solferino, we have the Campaign of France. Again, medals coming out of sort of every orifice, I was going to say, but it's not quite correct. We then have Manet, of course, who doesn't even bother contending and who actually sets up his own pavilion on the Champs-Élysées at his own expense. And, of course, here we have all of these. Well, not that one, but the absinthe drinker refers to Goya. This refers to Raphael. This refers again to Titian, completely different from the Little Master. However, he doesn't sell one single one of them. One of the reasons, of course, is that he's also extremely critical of Napoleon III's regime, but here, in reference to Goya's Dos Meios, we have the execution of Maximilian. Now, we now get to 1870, and this is a very interesting time. We have the siege of Paris by the Prussians. All of the Parisians are now, those who can, all able-bodied men, are asked to volunteer, and who volunteers into the cavalry movement. Of course, it's Meissonier. So he thinks he'll actually go out and defend Poissy, soon changes his mind when he sees that there are a few Prussians out there, and enrolls in his regiment, or Manet will enrol in his regiment. Now, Manet, of course, can hardly stay on a horse, is in agony, whereas, of course, Meissonier, the great cavalier, cuts a fine figure in the saddle. However, they don't seem to have talked about art at all. It was very interesting that they should have ended up fighting in the same battalion. Napoleon III is, of course, defeated at Sedan and will go into exile. You then have the convulsion, of course, of the French Commune. But in the meantime, Meissonier, during his time in the National Guard, actually again paints an uncharacteristic painting which harks back to that 1848 painting on the barricades. In other words, he has reacted to modernity or reality. So here, even though it's in his own characteristic way, Now, what he has here is a sort of allegory of the siege of Paris, where you have his mistress here. Now, Meissonier's extraordinarily long-suffering wife by now had a mental condition, as you know, and was extremely depressed, which is not surprising, and had finally died after having shut herself in a room for quite considerable time. He wasted no time, as I said, with marrying someone who had been living next door, for a while. And she's represented here as the sort of the figure of the Republic. And here we have one of his pupils, Reynaud, who died about in the age of 27, so was going to be the next Meissonier, according to Meissonier. So he puts him here, dead. Of course, he had to have exactly the greatcoat that he died in. He really wanted to have the body, but he couldn't, and so on. Anyway, so we do, however, have a very, even though it's done in a slightly anachronistically way, you do have a representation of the horrors of war. However, at the Salon of 1870, that painting is not awarded or even, given much merit. The one that wins is The Last Days of Corinth by Robert Fleury, a Pompier piece, if ever there was one. However, it does refer to the fall of a great city, which is Corinth, which is burning, as Paris was, but the people here are sort of lying around, the women are lying around half naked, looking absolutely desolate, as the soldiers point energetically out to sea from where the invaders are coming. Now, as we've talked about last week, in the aftermath of the siege of 1870, you have the Parisians refusing to accept the armistice and arming themselves against their own government, which will be the Commune of Paris, the bloody week in May when 30,000 die in the reprisals in 1 week in the streets. When the communards are finally defeated by their own government army, they set alight the main buildings and want to burn all of those monuments which represent the authority of the former regime of the Second Empire. Remember, we talked about this being the sort of the workers coming down and reclaiming the centre from which they'd been expulsed. Well, the Tuileries Palace, of course, is going to be completely burnt. And Meissonier one day is walking out and sees this extraordinary sort of vision of the horses on the Arc du Carrousel outside the Louvre, seen in this perspective through one of the wings of the burnt palace. And also up here in the room that is left standing, you see the coat of arms of the Battle of Marengo and the Battle of Austerlitz, which were the great battles won by Napoleon I. So he sees this in many ways as symbolic of the way in which the great past of France is being burnt by these hooligans, or as the Count de Neuwerkerk would put it, men who don't wash their underwear. So we actually have then Meissonier, of course, with obsession to detail, camps out in the ruins of the Tuileries. And actually there's someone there, I think there's a guard there who's set up to actually sort of make sure that he just comes to no, danger. And in fact, he's nearly killed by a falling cornice. He actually doodles, of course, as usual, on the walls and so on. But it's a very interesting painting because at least he does show the ruins of the Commune. Now, of course, the Impressionists, as we saw last week, the painters of regeneration and rebirth, even when they're painting the Tuileries Gardens, as we saw when we were in Paris together, allied any reference to civil war, any reference to the horrors of the Commune, and even sort of paint literally just round the corner, but make, even though the Tuileries was standing in this ruined state at the time, just don't reference it at all. Well, in any case, by 1873, the French had recovered sufficiently, paid back these billions of debts, thanks much to the Rothschilds and to the Jacquemart-Andrés, these great Protestant and Jewish bankers. They had managed to emerge and were again exhibiting at this wonderful exhibition of European fine arts held in Vienna in 1873. And it was at this exhibition that we have finally, in fact it's not going to be finally because even after it's exhibited and given every medal conceivable. Meissonier, who hasn't actually worked on it for several years because he couldn't during the war, takes it back and works on it for another 2 years, scraping down the horse's legs, because by now he's of course found via photography that he actually had the locomotion slightly wrong. Right? So obsession to detail again. All right, it is now the painting, the most expensive, which will be purchased by Stuart for the collection in France. There were a number of people who wanted it, but he would outbid all those people. People were ecstatic about it, but there were beginning to be criticisms. One person, Hussein, who was actually a Napoleonic scholar and would publish a 3-volume history of Napoleon I, wasn't impressed at all. First of all, he says there was a bit of a problem chronologically. When the Gros Frères, or the Great Cavalry, charged, they'd already charged and won the battle before Napoleon turned up. So therefore, it's anachronistic and chronologically wrong. Now, this was a great blow to Meissonier. What was I thinking of at the time? Because he spent most of his life hobnobbing with the greatest historian of the time, Thiers, who'd also written about Napoleon. So he saw himself as a great historian, but he'd actually got it wrong. The other thing that Hussein actually points out is there's a bit of a problem with having the cavalry charging across the picture plane here and wheeling round. One presumes they're wheeling round behind the emperor, because it would actually mean that if the enemy is over there, then Napoleon's got his back to the enemy. Well, that doesn't look very good. And if he doesn't have his back to the enemy and they're charging here, it means that they're running away. So one way or another, it wasn't looking good. And of course, this was on top of the problem with the locomotion of the horses. This, however, didn't daunt Meissonier, who continued to live from his prestige to the end of his life, which would have been about another 20 years, producing still small paintings, still lauded as the great old man of art. His bust was placed by Frémier. Right? Do you know Frémier, who is the person who did Joan of Arc, who is in front of the library here, and also Joan of Arc at the Rue des Pyramides in Paris? Was commissioned to do a statue of Meissonier. Now, this is him looking a bit like a druid, but really contemplating in many ways sort of posterity, because posterity really worried him. He constantly did say, okay, fame is fleeting, how would he be seen? But I don't think even in his most ghastly nightmares did he see that not only would he be criticised, he would be totally eradicated from artistic history. And it gets worse. His statue at Poissy is melted down for scrap during the First World War, and when André Malraux, the Minister of the Fine Arts under the de Gaulle government, comes to power, he wants to modernise art, and the first thing he does is to get rid of the statue of Meissonier from the Louvre, and it's now placed where the other statue had been scrapped in the gardens of Poissy. So sic passet gloria mundi, thus is the way of the world. And I think it's a very, very interesting way of looking at things when you see that you have these two people whose careers intersect at this time, where this discussion about what is reality, what is the painting of nature, where one response to this receives unanimous applause at the time, whereas the other is ignored. And of course now we have Manet, the champion of modernity, and the other one has completely disappeared from view. I think it's a fascinating, idea of the concept of the change in aesthetic theory. What will happen in another 50 years? Will Meissonier be resurrected? Hard to tell. What will happen to Picasso? What will the next century see as the great masters? So I suppose that's really what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you.